Some of you may remember a television show that originated in the States a few years back entitled Hoarders. It showcased men and women who had an addiction to accumulation. Sometimes they simply couldn't bear to get rid of anything ever, so their homes became overrun with stuff, even trash. Other times, there were particular things that they couldn't get enough of or couldn't bear to get rid of, such as magazines or grocery bags or yard sale treasures. One particular person I remember from the show had a side business selling knickknacks, and the knickknacks came to be her obsession. She was buying more than she could ever possibly sell, and they started to take over her home and her life. She was practically being buried by her inventory. She couldn't stop. And each of the hoarders featured in the show were paired with a counselor or psychiatrist and also an organizer who would try to help them start to view their possessions differently and arrange for a cleaning crew, sometimes comprised of friends and family members, who would come in and declutter and reorganize the living space and help to try to improve things. So essentially, the episodes were televised interventions. Now, Hoarders was a show that I never really got into. I knew of it, and I would watch it occasionally, such as when I was channel surfing in a hotel room and really couldn't find anything else better. The shows that I did see, I found uncomfortable and a little bit sideshowy and exploitative, even though many of the hoarders who were featured had family and friends who had contacted the show out of a very real and genuine concern for what they saw their loved one going through. But what I find truly fascinating about hoarders in the larger context of our cultural and social landscape is that the folks featured on that show, folks who had 1,000 newspapers piled in their living rooms, they wound up on a show like Hoarders as people in need of help, whereas celebrities who have walk-in closets larger than a lot of midtown condos receive photo spreads in magazines like Hello and are held up as people for us to admire. Why do we report and read stories about people adding an addition to their homes to make room for their collection of Gucci handbags differently than a story about someone who has 2,000 issues of Life magazine in their kitchen? I was reading with fascination this weekend about a man who briefly had a museum on the Las Vegas Strip to house and display his collection of Nike shoes. I've heard there's a home not too far from here that has a 3-story wine cellar. Yet somehow I don't think either the owner of that museum or the owner of that wine cellar would ever run any risk of winding up on a revival of Hoarders. Why is one form of excessive consumption a disorder to be treated and the other an achievement to be marveled at? We live in a time and a place in a culture in which we are conditioned to acquire and accumulate. Even if we don't have a collection of 1,000 anything, many of us aspire in some way to expand and upscale what we drive, what we wear, where we live. Ours is an era that embraces the sentiment of the parable that is before us today in spades. We might very well say that we live in an age of ever bigger and bigger barns, even if the barns aren't barns anymore. Drive up and down any street in any neighborhood in the West End, and you are likely to see this phenomenon at work. It's just not a barn being torn down and a bigger one built in its place. It's a house. A small house being torn down and a bigger house being built on top of where it used to stand. Acquire and accumulate. This is the prime directive of our materialistic, consumeristic culture. And this bigger barn mentality has created and continues to exacerbate a crisis of disparity and injustice in our world. One that's a lot bigger than just hoarding disorders or outlandish sneaker collections or hyper real estate markets. Right now, if we were to gather the poorest 3 billion people on our planet, 3 billion, almost half of the current human population, if we were to somehow able to gather together these 3 billion people in one place and ask them to pool their assets together, they would not have as much as the richest 42 people in the world. Let me say that again. Not 42 million, not 42,000, 42. The 42 richest people in the world have more combined wealth than the 3 billion people at the other end of the spectrum. This is the grotesque result of the bigger barn mentality. And it hasn't happened overnight. It's been building for decades. In 1985, Sam Walton was named by Forbes magazine as the richest man in America, with a total estimated net worth of $2.8 billion. In 2017, $2 billion was the minimum net worth you had to have to be listed on the Forbes 400. Talk about hoarding. If this isn't a situation that requires an intervention, I don't know what does. And it's not just because it's grossly unfair and unjust, it's also extremely dangerous. It's dangerous because the concentration of wealth is a concentration of power. And wealth disparity of this magnitude is a threat to democracy and the common good everywhere. It's also unjust and unfair because these 400 richest people in America, these 42 richest people in the world, they didn't acquire that level of wealth simply by working harder and working smarter than everybody else. There are systems and structures and policies in place that enable and perpetuate the concentration of that much wealth in the hands of so few. And those same systems and structures that helped place a few people on the top of this mountain are the same systems and structures that will help tuck 800 million kids in bed tonight hungry. These systems and these structures, this consumeristic culture, this bigger barn mentality, it's so pervasive we aren't even aware of it a lot of the time. We aren't even aware of the source of our own desires, our own inclinations, which is why it's important that we name it, that we have our eyes opened and we see it. But at the bottom, beneath all these structures and these systems and these policies, there is a mentality. There is this attitude. Build bigger barns, acquire and accumulate. And that's where we have to start. And we have to start with the understanding that the ultimate tragedy of all this is that it's all folly. You fool, God declares to the barn builder in Luke 12. Tonight your soul is required of you. Then whose will all this be? All this stuff you have stored up for yourself, whose will it be then? As Jesus introduced the parable, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, because possessions can't give us life. They can indeed shape our lives, but they cannot give us life. They are not the source of life. But they shape us in all kinds of ways. Our desire for them shapes us in all kinds of ways. For one thing, they shape our priorities. What we're working for, how we're working, how we spend our time. There was a young man in my church in Hyattsville, and I'll call him young because he's my age. But he had recently come to our church, and we got to know each other. A really smart, articulate guy, an accountant, very successful, devoted father. But he had lost his first marriage because of his bigger barn mindset. He was always working for that nicer car, that bigger house, that more exotic vacation. Things that he honestly wanted to give to his family. It wasn't a greedy place, but this is what he thought showing love to his family looked like. The problem was it took up all his time and his energy. He confessed to me one time as we were chatting in my office. He said sometimes we would be on vacation on the beach and I would be doing work in order to pay for that vacation. Because I thought that's what my wife, that's what my kids wanted. That was how he was trying to show love for them, but it didn't work because it can't work. And at the time, he was in another serious relationship, and he came to talk to me because he didn't want to make those same mistakes again. So this mindset shapes our priorities in very real ways and blinds us to a lot of things that God really wants us to see. But another thing this Bill Biggerbarn's mindset does is it instills us with fear and anxiety. The more we accumulate, the more worried that we become about losing it, about safeguarding it, about protecting it, and it puts us in this us against them, us against the world sort of posture. We have to protect what is mine, what is ours. Take careful note about what the context of this parable is. A man coming to Jesus, telling Jesus, "Jesus, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." And how many families do we know, whether in our own lives, our own experience, or in the news, who've been torn apart by arguments over money and property? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Well, what does life consist of? I mean, that's why Jesus came, to give us life. Well, ultimately, life consists of love. Love of God, love of neighbor. These are the two poles of the way of Jesus. And love gives and receives. Love looks out for others as well for ourselves. Love shares. Love is generous, not just toward other people, not just toward ourselves, but also toward God. Right? It's love of God and love of neighbor to which we are called. And if we look at the life of the early church in Acts, this is exactly what they discovered as they lived out life between these two poles. What does Acts tell us about how they lived? They held everything in common. They looked out for each other. They provided for the members of the community as each member had need, and no one lacked anything. No one was burdened by not having enough, and I would also suggest none were burdened by the anxiety and the fear of having too much. It should be noted, too, that Jesus doesn't tell the man in the crowd, or the character in the parable for that matter, to do anything particular with all that has been stored up. Once Jesus challenges the concept of storing up so much. And I think that's because the solution really lies in the cultivation of a new, different attitude and mindset, not just a list of do's and don'ts. If we were to keep reading, Jesus would tell his disciples, don't worry, this is part of this new mindset. Look how God cares for other animals in creation, other parts, other life in creation. How much more does God care about you? Do not worry. God's got you. Nevertheless, there are instructions that we can find and identify in the gospel, in the law, in the prophets to help us get started and guide us into living a life based on this new, different mindset. It gives us clues about what this new, different mindset of love lived between these two poles looks like. Because love of God and love of neighbor, this is not a New Testament concept. This is an Old Testament concept. Jesus wasn't reinventing the wheel when he gave the great commandment. He was simply redirecting our attention back to where it needed to be. So what does this love look like, love of God and neighbor? Well, love of God looks like worship. That's why we're here today, to worship, to praise God, to orient ourselves, our lives individually and our lives together toward God. It involves having no other gods, no idols before the one true God whom we've come here today to worship. And the Apostle Paul isn't shy in naming greed as an idol. Love of God involves worship, but worship involves more than singing and praising and studying our Bibles. It also involves sacrifice. It involves giving of ourselves and what we possess. And one of the things that's so interesting and distinct about the way that God in the Old Testament instructs the Israelites to give sacrifice is much different than the way that other cultures sacrifice to their gods. The Greeks and the Romans, for example, when they would make sacrifice to their gods, they would take a certain specified part of the animal and put that on the altar and burn it. And then they'd have a barbecue with the rest. They'd have a feast, a celebration as worship. In the Old Testament, God demands the whole animal. The first fruits of your herd, of your crop. Unblemished, the best of what you have to offer. And it's all offered. You don't derive any direct benefit from that offering. That's how we show our worship and our love of God. It's how we show our trust in this God to provide for us and to return to us, to protect us. It involves tithing, giving 10% of what we have to God, to the larger body, the larger people of God, in support of everything that is done there. It also involves Sabbath, resting. Not just resting from our labor, but keeping the Sabbath holy, resting in honor of God, resting in a way that's a reminder to us that the world really doesn't revolve around what we do, who we are. And isn't that often what we think? I can't stop because if I stop, all this other will stop. Well, one day your soul and my soul is going to be demanded of us, and everything that we do will stop, and the world will continue on. That's part of the lesson that Sabbath tries to teach us incrementally as a way to pull us back into our proper relationship with God, with self, with the world. And the prophets had a lot of things to say to the Israelites, a lot of strong worded things to say to Israelites who tried to rush through the Sabbath or other festivals and observances so they could get back to making money. Keep the Sabbath holy. And when you do end the Sabbath and return to work, don't exploit your workers. This is a transition to what love of neighbor is all about. Treat your neighbor fairly. Treat your neighbor as yourself. Want for your neighbor what you want for yourself, no matter who your neighbor happens to be. So don't exploit your workers, those of you who employ other people. And those of you who are owners, who are the producers in the people among the people of God, there are instructions for us not to consume everything we produce. That when you harvest your field, don't go through and pick every last grain, every last berry, whatever it is you're growing. Leave some intentionally for other people, for the poor, for those who don't have, so that they can come along and glean and be provided for. This is how Ruth supports herself and Naomi in the early part of that story, by gleaning from the fields what was left over. And all of this carries forward into the New Testament as we hear what John the Baptist and Jesus and the apostles have to say. John the Baptist preached that if we have 2 cloaks, we should give one to someone who doesn't have one. If we have more food than we need, we should share some of it with those who don't have enough. If we are in positions of power, we shouldn't use that power to exploit other people, to get more than what we're entitled to. We hear Jesus telling us that the Gentiles, they lord it over one another, but that's not how it's going to be among you if you are my disciples. In the kingdom of heaven, in the kingdom of God, those who wish to be the greatest will be the servant of all. We hear Jesus say, go and do likewise. After telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, put your resources to use to help those who you discover in need. If we step back, it's all about generosity in one form or another. And it's about generosity because it's about love in one form or another. Generosity is really the right hand of love. And that's the new spirit, that's the new mentality, that's the new mindset and heart set that Jesus is calling us to, that we have to cultivate as the people who live between these 2 poles of the way of Jesus. And generosity is not just about how we prevent our possessions from possessing us. It's really about how we express our love to God and to our neighbor. And these instructions are here because I think oftentimes it's in the doing of these things that we condition ourselves to have a different heart set and mindset, rather than gaining a new heart set and mindset and then acting and behaving differently. Our response to God, our response to neighbor, our response rooted in love as disciples of Jesus as the church is not to acquire and accumulate, it is to love and to give generously, to give intentionally, not just conveniently, to give because we trust God to be the God we worship, a God who supports us and cares for us and will provide for us. And so we give because we aren't worried. We give because life lived between these two poles, love of God, love of neighbor, on the way of Jesus, isn't a life fixated or organized around building bigger barns in any way, shape, or form. Because all of us, no matter how big or how small our barns may be, all of us are just passing through. The day will come when all of us will have our souls demanded of us, and we can't take any of it with us. Heaven knows the pharaohs tried, and there are any number of museums you can go and visit to see how successful they were. Ultimately, it all comes back to the fact that it all goes back to God, because it all comes from God originally. All creation, all life, everything seen and unseen. As my friend and mentor, Dr. John Claypool, used to say, in the end, we're really all just beggars telling other beggars where to find bread. He also told a story that I want to tell in conclusion this morning. It's a story that I've told before, but it's a story well worth telling again. It's a story that Dr. Claypool heard from a rabbi friend of his about two brothers who were farmers. Their dad owned a farm. As they were growing up, they worked with their father on this farm. And when their father died, the farm passed to them. And instead of dividing it equally between them, they decided, you know what, all this time we've been working this farm together. If we divide it, it'll be smaller, and so each farm will be smaller, and so neither one of us will really have enough. Let's continue to work it together. And that's what they did. And they continued to work hard. As time went by, the elder brother fell in love, got married, had a family. And when he got married, he and his family, with his brother's help, they built another farmhouse on the other side of the property. So the two brothers continued to work the farm together even though they lived apart. And they worked hard. The soil was fertile. They had everything they needed. As time went on, they were able to acquire other plots of land adjacent to their farm. They grew their farm, and they lived very comfortably. One night, the elder brother was sitting on the front porch of his house, and in the bright moonlight, he could see across the farm to his brother's house. And he got to thinking, my brother and I, we've worked this land all of our lives. It's been good to us. God's been good to us. But the day is coming, and coming sooner than we like to think. We're not going to be able to continue working this land. And when that day comes, we're going to have to rely upon everything that we've stored up over these many years, everything that we've saved. And my brother, he never found that certain special someone. He didn't have a wife or kids to look after him. I think when that day comes, he's going to need a little more than I'm going to need, because I'm going to have people to take care of me. I think I ought to give my brother some of what I've saved up. But he's a stubborn guy. He would probably never accept it if I offered it. But I know what I'll do. The next full moon, I'll load some stuff from my barn onto a wagon, and I'll take it over there, and I'll put it in his barn. And that way he'll have it. He'll never know where it came from, but he'll have it. And the elder brother was very pleased with himself. And so over the course of the next 28 or so odd days, he went into his barn after work. He began preparing this wagon. He began loading it up with all the stuff that he thought his brother would need. And on the night of the next full moon, he set out on his mission. And as he was making his way through the field, suddenly he heard this noise. And it got louder and louder. And he realized it was coming, whatever it was, right at him. He didn't know if it was a wild animal. He didn't know what it was. He was very afraid. And so he stopped, hoping that whatever it was would pass by in the field and keep on going. But lo and behold, it got louder and louder and louder and louder until something burst through the crops. It was his younger brother pulling a wagon heaped up with all kinds of stuff. And the two brothers looked at each other. And the younger brother said, "What are you doing here?" And the elder brother said, "What are you doing here?" And the elder brother said, I'm the eldest. You answer first." And so the younger brother said to his brother, he said, "Well, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, but last month during the full moon, I was sitting on the front porch of my house. And in the light of the full moon, I could see your house on the other side of the field. And I got to thinking, what a good life we've had together. How good this land has been to us. How good God has been to us. But then I realized the day's not far off when we're not going to be able to work this land the way that we've worked it all these years. And I got to thinking about you and your family, and I got to thinking about that day. And I thought to myself, when that day comes, you've got a wife and kids you've still got to provide for. I've got just me. I don't think I'm going to need as much as you will in our retirement. But I knew that you're a stubborn guy, and if I offered you anything, you probably wouldn't take it. So I've been loading up my wagon with some stuff that I think you could use, and I was sneaking across the field here to put it in your barn. So when you needed it, you would have it. And you wouldn't have to know where it came from. And the rabbis say that even though that night there wasn't a cloud in the sky, it began to rain ever so softly. Because God was weeping tears of joy that two of God's children finally got it. There is enough. God created a world of plenty. There is enough. There's enough for all of us to have everything that we need. If we will think about each other and not just ourselves, if we will give thanks to God and understand where it all comes from, if we're willing to be generous and not fearful, if we're willing to receive as well as to give. If we will allow God, allow Christ to cultivate us, in us, this new kingdom heart set and mindset, love of God, love of neighbor, that will lead us to a life of generosity, we will all have enough. Our neighbors will have enough. Our world will have enough. Our church will have enough. Because with God, there is always enough. May we offer ourselves more fully to God in heart, mind, and spirit, that we might learn not to build bigger barns, but open wide the doors and share generously with God, with our neighbor, and with each other. Amen.